engaged history, the final frontier. These are the practices of a new generation of historians. Our mission? To conduct research and analysis in partnership with communities, to co-create knowledge that is locally meaningful and that will inform public policy, to boldly go where no historian has gone before. I wanted to keep it a little bit light at the beginning, and we just had William Shatner visit Saskatoon, and my son went and got an autograph for me, which was awesome. Thank you very much for having me here today. I really do appreciate it. It's been wonderful getting to know sort of active historians across Canada through the website over the past couple of years. Used to that by Jim. Thank you very much. Today I want to talk about the work I do is community-based, primarily in First Nations communities. Also, I work in some Métis communities, and then also for some nonprofit organizations and heritage groups. And what I want to talk about is the way that we can engage and what does engagement mean. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the debates that are currently going on within the field of community engaged scholarship as relates to historians. And then come up at the end, I think, with sort of a bit of a rousing sort of call to arms. So I will start, and I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to go fast. I'm doing something wrong, though. No. Just the arrows, right?
Yep. Yep, turned it off.
Okay, let's start over again. No, just kidding. Okay, so what I want to do, I want to approach this by defining the three terms: community, engaged, history. Because I think oftentimes we do history without thinking about what we're doing. And perhaps more often than that, people outside our discipline have impressions about what historians do. I remember a thing that stuck in my mind. I don't know how many of you can remember book reviews you've read over the years, but there's one book review from 1990 that stands out in my mind really clearly. It was Robin Fisher writing a review of the Smithsonian Handbook of American Indians, Volume 7, Northwest Coast, which had all these chapters, each one contributed by a different author. And two chapters in the book were explicitly historical, both of which were written by anthropologists. And Robin Fisher, in his review, noted there's still a pervasive sense out there that anybody can do history. And I think that is the case. And I think as historians, part of our job is to explain that what we do isn't just describing the past. So history is what historians do. Right? This is when we think historically. And there are 10 what I call benchmarks of history. Some of you might know the wonderful scholarship of Peter Seixas. He's identified 6 benchmarks of history. I added 4 more so that it'd be the same number that God had with the 10 Commandments. And I thought that might be good. So if we think of it here, history is not the past, of course, or the study of change over time, as some people often in the media describe it, nor is it the study of events. It's what we do when we think historically. And that means it's something incredibly powerful. So I've noted over the years that God either can't or won't change history. He won't change the past, I should say, but historians, they do. And that gives us an incredible amount of power. And we do that through historical thinking. And as a result, we need to be especially careful with what we do because it has huge impacts. It affects people's lives all around the world. Some people, some institutions, certainly some corporations, have the power and the capacity to write their own history. But there's a huge number of people out there who don't. And I think we have an obligation to those people. Oh, you can't see what I've got here, but those corporations, those nation states, those powerful institutions don't always do good history. You don't need, I don't need to, I'm sure you can think of bad history that's being publicly shared around the country right now. And bad history is, in my view, every bit as dangerous as bad chemistry. It is dangerous. It affects people, it hurts people, and we have to be careful about how we do it. So today in the world, for example, there are over 7 billion people who suffer from bad or contested history. Over 7 billion. You don't hear about that in the news the way you should, right? Now, that's more than the number of people who suffer from bad hygiene, for example. And that's, you can laugh at that part. But it's also right up there with the same number of people in the world, or just slightly more perhaps, than those who suffer from difficult access to clean, fresh, healthy water. Bad history comes from poor historical thinking. and we have a way to change that. We give voice to the oppressed, we give voice to the marginal, we bring their stories forward in a way that they can't necessarily do it on their own. And there's all sorts of reasons that marginalized groups can't do it. In some cases, the marginalized groups are simply gone. If we're talking about 19th century labor class in England, they happen to have all died. They're still laborers today, but that's not necessarily the community we're talking about. We're talking about a past community that has links to the present. I'm going to go through the 10 principles kind of quickly because I think they're important, and I don't think we talk about them enough. One is establishing significance. Why do we study certain topics? Why do we make them historical topics? Why do we begin to research them? We need to justify that, and part of that is speaking truth to power, I think. Second one is the use of primary sources, whether those are oral, written, archaeological, artistic. We draw directly from our primary sources. We're very interested in the role of continuity and change and their relationship to one another. It's not just change over time, but it's how does continuity and change interact? What are causes and what are consequences of actions over time? As historians, we take perspective, race, class, gender, and we have an ethical obligation to both our sources and to the people that we discuss and describe. Dominic LeCapper has done some wonderful work on this coming out of his research with Holocaust survivors. Here's the ones that I've added, though, that I think are important. History is intensely a product of interpretation. And I've talked to lots of people from different disciplines who seem to think that what historians do is what I would define as an archivist job. That is, you find and preserve and make available documents, but documents don't speak for themselves, as we all know. As historians, we use metaphor to communicate meaning. Historians are the best metaphors next to poets, I've come to conclude, right? Poets are the best. They're wonderful. They can really make a metaphor work, but as historians, we're constantly having to explain how the Battle of Passchendaele was like hell, right? We use metaphors all the time. All the identities that we talk about in the past are not fixed somehow in some primordial fashion. They're not inherent. They're all built in relationships. You can only be a father if there's such a thing. You can only be a parent if there's such a thing as a child. You can only be a teacher if there are learners. You can only be a Canadian if there are non-Canadians. And that means that every historical identity that we deal with has to be understood and situated within the push-pull factors of identity construction. And finally, good history is always communicated through narrative. It's about stories. So engagement. If that's what history is, what is engagement? I think it's too often, at least on my campus up until recently, it's been too often conflated with outreach. And I think outreach is best regarded instead as a component of what engagement is. Engagement is something much broader. We have to be really careful too, because outreach itself, old school outreach, which is what extension departments used to do on campuses back in the 1910s through the 1970s, it can smack of arrogance. It can be arrogant. It's the scholarly expert who's taking information out to the community and telling them what they need to know, right? And you don't want to be that guy, right? Engage history is doing something where you're pulling yourself into the community, however that's defined, and we will talk about that in a second, in a way that the community is informing and shaping the product that's being produced, the knowledge that's being generated. And that means that there's a scale. And on one end, you can have no engagement at all. And good history can be done without engagement. And then there's a full-on engagement. And bad history can be done with full engagement if it's not done properly. So I'm not saying one is good and one is bad, but it's important to distinguish, I think. There's all kinds of opportunities for teaching, research, and learning along this spectrum. Where do you involve students? Where do you start to go from creating knowledge as a scholar to co-creating knowledge with a community? These sorts of questions are what we need to work out for every individual product. It's not as though every project should be at the far end. It's that you need to find out where the right place is to answer the questions that need to be answered. So all along that way, you figure out what sort of research can be done. What research can be done by graduate students? What research can be done by community members? What research can be done by undergraduate students? And then ideally, we integrate teaching opportunities into that process all along. What we emerge with then is a definition of engaged scholarship that starts out by saying, if it's fully engaged, is the community involved in the planning? Are they involved in the implementation? And are they involved at the final stage, the assessment stage? It doesn't mean they have to agree with everything you do either. And if you build a good partnership, people will come to respect you even if they disagree with you. And that's around that deep sort of engagement that we're sort of striving for. Is the activity addressing an identified community need? It can be curiosity-driven, but if you can shape that curiosity-driven project so that it's actually doing something that has a policy outcome, some kind of pragmatic outcome, it's richer. Is it meaningful to the community in some way? How do you identify that? Have the community university agreed upon expected outcomes and benefits? This is where I did a big study at the University of Saskatchewan 3 years ago, and this is where the big sort of breakdown occurs, right? Along the way, the academic is saying, well, I work on this cycle where, 8 months in the winter I teach, 4 months in the summer I try to do my research. And the community is saying, well, we approached you in November, and why didn't you start until May? Sort of thing, like there's out of step. And so what are the outcomes and what's the processes along the way? Is there clear evidence of benefit to the community? And is there clear evidence of benefit to the faculty and the university? Those things aren't mutually incompatible. Those are things that should inform one another. And then you need to bring in students, I think, anyway. Link it to your own faculty research programs. Don't dive into something that you don't have an expertise in. Rather, bring a degree of expertise and then humble yourself by going into a community and trying to find a new way to learn and relearn what you think you already got to start on. So if that's the case, once we have those sort of things in place, we end up with something like this, I think, where the activity, the community needs, the benefits, and the involvement are all informing one another. They're all building together towards the inside. Okay, and finally, my third term, the defining community. So now, ironically, this is the term that is the least well-defined and has the least amount of consensus around it within the community-engaged scholarship. Disciplinary perspectives have a lot to do with this, and I think that's fine. The way a sociologist defines community is different than the way a historian defines community, than the way an anthropologist defines community, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is that all of our disciplines, we don't necessarily respect the way the other people define community. And that creates problems when it comes to having your SSHRC grant reviewed, when you have your article peer reviewed, when you go into a community that's used to working with one of those sister disciplines, and they say, well, that's not how the anthropologist did things last month, or they expect you to behave like a sociologist, or after you've been in there, they expect the sociologist to behave like a historian. So we need to do a better job of respecting and honoring the different disciplinary perspectives. Basic kind of questions emerge. I know this happens when I talk to my dean or when I talk to the vice president provost about supporting community-engaged research. Is it necessarily local? Can you do community-engaged research in Africa from York University? Is it necessarily small scale? Do communities have to have a geographic expression? Does it have to be a place where there's a community? Can they be created through meaningful thematic groupings? All Indigenous people in some way, are they linked sufficiently that someone could do a project that wasn't grounded in a single Indigenous community? What about the subaltern communities that we know exist within every other community? So you get band council approval, or you work with a local municipality and you get them to endorse a project, then you get into the community and you find that in fact there are sub-communities that oppose or set up an opposition to the project initially created. And then ultimately, I think a big question that senior administrators on campuses like to ask is, well, can there be economically linked communities? And I think in part this can be code words for corporations. Perhaps, I think. But the point I think here is to understand how different disciplines come at these. One current stream of argument says that communities are groups of people who feel so powerfully connected that they're willing to fight and potentially die to preserve the community. Now, that's sort of, if you think of a perspective, a sliding scale, that's probably at the one end. But at the other end, you can get to a point where people aren't willing to fight or die for something. And I think in the end, those people then aren't community, they're participants. They're individuals who are participating perhaps in a project, but that's a different thing. So if you think about that, who is willing to die and fight and identify profoundly with a community? I mean, in Canada, we have all sorts of ways that this can be done. Indigenous groups, activist groups, gendered groups, environmental groups, union groups. It's everywhere. The point, I think, is for us to start putting those blocks together in ways that reflect the way communities themselves define themselves. It's not up to us to go and define whether or not this is a community, as a lot of your ethics boards might ask you to do when you're trying to set up a project. It's rather about trying to have the community define who they are so that you can respond to that. And again, this suggests a spectrum, I think, from individual to community. And it's not as though work on one end is less valuable than work on another, it's just that it's a different type of work. So can a corporation be a community? I'm not sure. A nation state, can it be a community? I think in certain circumstances. An NGO, yes, I suspect so, but often they try to represent communities, and so they become a filter between you and the community that you're trying to connect with. An extended family, certainly. A faith group, perhaps. A village. I mean, I'm just trying to throw out some examples of what it might be and what it might not be. But I think a community is something that you know when you find it, right? You know it when you see it. But you can't always define it in the abstract, in the absence of the human relationships that give it coherence. So the question becomes, how are you engaged often? That's the question that administrators will often ask on campuses. And I like to think that the question can only be answered by another question, really. So, you know, one of those tricky kind of answers that frustrate people. But the answer is really, how engaged is the community in the project that you're talking about? If it's community engagement, you can be as engaged as you want, but if they're not engaged back, it's not engagement. So really the power isn't in your hands. All you can do is enable and facilitate community engagement. And this could look different depending on the type of project you're doing, whether it leans hard to the social sciences, more to the side of the humanities, if it's borrowing on interdisciplinary perspectives from sociology or anthropology compared to literary criticism or whatever it might be. And now here's the part that I think is sort of debated, and then I'm going to get to my concluding comments. How am I doing for time? 60? I'm still good. Good, excellent. There's a growing body of scholarship out there that says that the community engagement of any kind is inherently colonial in nature because it's predicated on the process of othering people. I will work with that community. They are othered in some way. They are othered as a gender group, othered as an ethnic group, othered as an indigenous group, othered as a class group in some way. And that inherently, by having that othering process, you are reinforcing old imperialist ways of thinking and imperialist histories. I think that's true. But I don't think that should stop us. In other disciplines, the answer to that problem has largely come to the idea of what we need is humility, which I think is a powerful tool that we should embrace. The idea of not knowing, going into a community and not knowing, learning to unlearn what you currently know. Indigenizing is a lot of the language in the subfield that I work in with Aboriginal history is to indigenize your mind, decolonize your mind, go into a community and unlearn what you thought were the priorities and what you thought were the hierarchies. But as historians, I think while we can learn from these sister disciplines, and I think we need to embrace that, I think we also have certain tools that are quite radical within our own disciplinary tradition that we shouldn't forget about, that we should bring to the fore. And I think oftentimes they don't get brought to the fore because they are so difficult. A lot of anthropologists which I work with in partnerships often, are quick to point out that historians don't have methods. Right? You guys have approaches, that's what they'll say to me, right? And I think that's actually a good thing, having approaches rather than strict methods. But on the other hand, there are principles. If we do history correctly, I think we can escape the confines of our learned identities, the identities that we have grown up with that we think are ascribed, but that we've learned our gendered identity, our class identity, our ethnic identity, right? We can escape those and we can find freedom. And here I'm drawing on the seminal philosophical historical works of R.G. Collingwood from the 1940s, where he says that through the process of asking the right questions and thinking historically as we generate our answers, we can actually escape. We can get the greatest gift that any discipline can offer. We can escape ourselves and be free of ourselves. Now, inherently, that sounds like it could be very, very dangerous because it's all about cultural appropriation if it's done wrong. I'm escaping myself. I'm thinking like a 19th century Inuit woman. Dangerous, right? For a white guy who's from the South, who's et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. intellectual imperialism can be the result, right? And we know how bad that is. We know how hurtful that can be. And so I'm not in any way advocating that, and that's not what Collingwood was advocating at all. But we can mitigate that risk, I think, good historians, if we recognize that all of our interpretations, all of our efforts at historical thinking are inherently incomplete. They're always a work in process. They can always be refined and made better in the future. In the same way that the metaphors we use to describe things can always be refined, always be redone, relooked at. If we can escape our perspective and know that in that escaping, we've never fully escaped it, and that's the internal sort of contradiction that is where all the exciting things happen. We're trying to escape it, we're trying to think like somebody else, we're trying to put ourselves in their position, but knowing that we can never achieve it. That in itself, I think, is the powerful point where communities will open up and begin to trust. At least that's been my experience. And that means that history can offer a freedom by being active, by breaking the bounds of our own thinking through the tools that our discipline and sister disciplines, sibling disciplines can provide to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for